Hello YouTube, this is UMails03. So now we've been talking for several lessons about regular expressions, and we just have a few more things to say about it. And then in this video, we're mostly going to be talking a little bit more about functions. Okay, we're going to be talking about functions and arguments for functions. Okay, so what I want to do is essentially establish that in this video. But remember, we have to import the re module. Okay, and then we need to say, if we ever say print of xy, or we ever say print and then we have multiple arguments into the print function, it'll print the multiple things on the same line. And we said that's convenient, maybe even a little bit more convenient than just concatenating with the plus sign, because this will go ahead and give us a space in between the words, right? So this would say, how are you, instead of how are you? Okay, so hopefully that's clear to you. So then what we can do is we can review a lot of the things that we've talked about in the previous videos, right? I think in the last video, we got a chance to do a lot of good review of a lot of these concepts that we have been establishing along the way. And so what I wanted to do in this video is remind ourselves of how, remember, we have two functions here. So isMatch and isSearch. And again, isMatch will return true if word to check begins with pattern. IsSearch will return true if word to check, or if my word, I guess here, begins with my, contains my pattern somewhere in the string. Doesn't have to be at the beginning. So hopefully that's clear to you. In the previous video, we said that basically we can have groupings. And so what groupings are is it's parentheses that will envelop or enclose a sequence or a set of characters. Okay, and so basically that set or sequence of characters will be treated as one singular unit into a regular expression. Okay, and then you can operate on that regular, or on that sequence with a meta character, for example. So essentially, in the previous video, we said that we would be looking for, at least one repetition of the letter S somewhere in pair, right? So then if we go ahead and run this, then I guess there's already a formatting error. So line 261, I was trying to get another example ready and I didn't comment out that line. So then, sorry, if we go ahead and run main.py here, then you can go ahead and see, sorry, I'm getting a little lost here. So then you can go ahead and see false, right? So that would be after we saw the printing example, printing multiple arguments, you can see false here because pair does not contain at least one repetition of S, right? But that's what the plus sign means. It just means at least one repetition. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then read.findAll of, and then we went ahead and ran this, right? And we saw that basically if there are between 1 and 9 repetitions of the word sets, we want to basically return a list with every occurrence where that happens. So we have sets and sets, right? Because you can see that there's 1 to 9 repetitions of sets here at the beginning, right? You can see one repetition and then another repetition here, sets. But then also you can go ahead and see sets here. Okay, so hopefully that's clear to you. Right, but then what if we had gone and said what if you had said 2 to 9 repetitions? So then if you go ahead and run the list, you get an empty list. And the reason is because the sets here overlaps with the sets here. Okay, so if you're already counting this sets, then you only have ETS left. You only have ETS, right? Okay, so hopefully that's clear to you that you would no longer have 2 to 9 repetitions of sets anywhere in this string, right? You have set multiple times, but you don't have more than one sets unless you separate it with this word bounded. Okay, so hopefully that's clear to you. And that's why you would have an empty string if you ran re.findAll with this particular pattern and this particular word to check. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then another example with these numbered repetitions. So what if you were looking for between 1 and 2 repetitions of the character of basically this grouping where you have 2 character classes? You have anything that will match between capital A and capital E. So you're talking about a capital A, capital B, capital C, capital D, or capital E. Same thing for the second letter, right? So if you have between 1 and 2 repetitions of that, then that would go ahead and return true. But this returns false since F and F don't make it in there, right? What if you had said F and B, right? This would still return false because you don't have between 1 and 2 repetitions of A to E and then A to E, right? So because F is not between A and E, so hopefully that's clear, right? But then if you say, FBA, then you would go ahead and have the sequence that you were looking for, right? Then you would go ahead and B and A would go ahead and be satisfying that pattern. Okay, so hopefully that's clear to you. And then we talked about groups, right? So we said group pattern, right? And we said that groups are basically collections of expressions, right? Collections of characters that we can try to match for in our sentence, in our word to check, right? So we have the alphabet here, and you can see a lot of groups, right? So BC is a group, but also C is a group within BC. And we talked about that in the previous video, and we ran some of these outputs, right? So if we ran p.group, then you just get the entire string or pattern that was matched. Same thing with p.group of 0. Okay, so p.group of 0 works the same way as p.groups. Hopefully that's clear to you. And then again, if you just go ahead and say p.group of 1, p.group of 2, right? We could do this with a while loop. That would probably be a better way of seeing all these, right? But you could go ahead and see the groups individually from the left, right? So you would see BC, and then just C, and then D, E, F, G, right? So what if you kept going? Then you would get HI, and then just H, okay? And then you would get J, and then that's it. So there would be 6 total individual groups, and then an entire string that was matched. And that's why you see 6 individual groups in this tuple, right? So we said p.groups returns a tuple with all individual groups that were matched within the string. So hopefully that's clear to you. Hopefully that makes sense. And then you could go, what if we said print read.find all of group pattern, and then you had the entire alphabet? So then if we go ahead and run this code, then it would just be a list with one element, and that one element is the tuple. Okay. We can also think about a special sequence that will basically match one character or another character, or one sequence or another sequence. Okay, so basically if you have this vertical line here, basically that's the meta character for or. So if you wanted to see if there's one character or another character, one name or another name, one word or another word. Okay, so hopefully that's clear to you, and we'll see an example. And then we also have special sequences. So if we say \D, basically if you put that into a group, or if you put it into a regular expression, it's equivalent to a 0 to 9. So it's a special sequence for a digit. So hopefully you remember that, because we're going to do an example. If you do a capital D, that's the opposite. So that'll match anything that's not a digit. So remember when we were talking about character classes, we said basically it's a range of characters that's contained within square brackets. And we said in the previous video that if we have one of these up arrows contained at the beginning of the square brackets, it has the effect of inverting the 0 to 9. So this will match anything that's not 0 to 9, that's not a digit, okay? And so that's what would be the effect of capital D, whereas lowercase d does match a digit, okay? So they're opposites of each other just by virtue of being lowercase or uppercase sensitive. Okay, and then also again, this vertical thing means the or meta characters. So hopefully that makes sense to you, okay? And we're just going to see a few more examples, then we're going to move on to new content, okay? So then what we could do is if you say Jeremiah turns 6 next month, right? And then another pattern is 6 or 7, right? And then another pattern could be Kelsey or Christina. So what if you say print is search of another pattern 1 with another sentence? So is there 6 or 7 contained somewhere in this string? Yes, there's a 6, right? But is there Kelsey or Christina contained somewhere in this string? No, there's not. There's neither of them, right? So you get true for the second to last thing printed to the console, but you get false for the last thing printed to the console. So hopefully that's clear to you. What if you have a phone number, which I just pulled out of my ass? I promise you that's not my phone number. You can try it if you want. And then you can go ahead and have 3 repetitions of any digit. Okay, so that's what this code does. Remember, we said that if you have numbers, or if you have 2 numbers in curly braces, it gives you a range of repetitions. But if you just put one number in curly braces, it's a number of repetitions. And we said that the \D is a special sequence for a digit. So basically this will match if there are 3 digits and then a hyphen, you know, a dash, and then 3 digits, and then a dash, and then 4 digits, right? And it doesn't have to just be restricted to that. So you could say my number is, right? And then you have things that are not that, but as long as you have this sequence contained somewhere within my number, right? It doesn't have to be at the beginning, because we're using our is search function rather than the is match function. So that would be true. But then if you go ahead and say is match of my pattern and my number, so then if we go ahead and run this line of code, you would get false, right? Same thing for capital D. So what if you only wanted numbers only in a particular string? And you could say no numbers, right? And then you could say true numbers only, right? And then you could go ahead and invert this. But I was going to show you another example, but that's just more confusing. But anyway, the whole goal is to show you these different meta characters and these special sequences. And as long as you get familiar, just practicing using them on your own, being familiar with the difference between matching and searching, right? Understanding what this vertical line does, right? The idea that you're looking for one character or another character. Being familiar with \D, \D, knowing that those are equivalent to digits or non-digits. Knowing that the plus sign means at least one repetition. Knowing that square brackets means that we're enveloping a range of characters, okay? So hopefully these things make sense to you, and that's sort of our discussion of regular expressions, which took longer than I thought it was going to, but it's better to have more information about the topic than not enough. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about arguments to functions. So you'll recall that a function can print something, change a variable, return something, or do all of those things. A function can be an input to another function. We said that's a nested function. I think we talked about that in lesson 14. A function can be completely defined within another function. That was called an inner function. I think that was like lesson 28 or 29. A variable can refer to a function. We said that was called a function reference variable. We talked briefly about that in 1 or 2 videos. We also talked about lambda function in 1 or 2 videos. So basically the idea that you could define a function on one line. We said that data types of inputs to a function are arbitrary, but must make sense within the context of the function. And successful software engineers should write clean doc strings that show description, parameters to the function, and the values returned by the function, okay? So basically, parameters to a function can take default values by specifying them in the function header, okay? So basically what we could do is we could basically come up with a function where we have 3 inputs here. So we have f, right? It's a very simple function, it's one line. And you have 3 inputs, x, y, and z. But what you'll realize here is you actually have 2 inputs that seem to already have values. And so these are called default values. And the question is, what do you do? Why would you have variables as inputs to a function if you're just going to give them values? Okay, and so what this would do is this would print the sum of the 3 values. So presumably you're going to pass in x, and y and z, like Python has already come up with, right? Like the programmer has already specified. But let's see how this works, right? So what we'll do is we'll try to run f of 8. And remember, this method already prints. So you don't say print f of 8. You just run f of 8, okay? It's called a void method. It doesn't return anything, but it says 110 because 8 plus 2 plus 100 is 110. This is an example of default arguments, okay? Default values for arguments. And one of the things I'll specify is that any arguments that don't have default values, so the x, need to come before the arguments that do take default values, so the y and z here. Okay, so then I can just show you, but if you say x equals 5, right, and then you go ahead and not have z be default, you can see it's underlined in red, and you can see Python throws an error. So non-default parameter follows default parameter. So you cannot get away with that. What if you say f of x equals 10? So this is an example of basically naming the input to the function. So this is an example of you can refer to the inputs to a function by their actual names if you'd like. Okay, so that's just f of x equals 10, right? But then if you just say f of 15, 12, 12, it's implied that the first argument is x, the second argument is y, and the third argument is z. And in this case, we override the default values. So we pass in parameters for y and z rather than using 2 and 100. So hopefully that's clear to you. We're not going to be using the default values. We'll be using the values that we passed in by parameters. So then if we go ahead and run it, we find that 15 plus 12 is 39. So hopefully that makes sense to you. You could do the same thing by referring to the actual names of the variables. You can see in the definition of the function, we called the variable names x, y, and z. Those are the parameters. And so we would want to refer to those variables as x, y, and z, but it's optional, but you could do that, right? And then that would just add 1, 1, and 3, okay? What if you just have f of 5, 4? So that's kind of confusing, right? Because here, obviously, the 5 is going to be assigned to x, right? X does not take a default value. So the first arguments of the function will always be assigned to x. The question is the 4 assigned to the y or the z? And then do we use the default value, right, for the other variable? And the answer is we're going to fill them up in order, right? So what we're going to do is here, y is assigned to 4, but z will remain with its default value of 100. So this will go ahead and add 5 plus 4 plus 100, which is 109. So hopefully that makes sense to you. But that's an example of a function that has default inputs, right? So then you can choose, you can decide whether or not you want to use the default values or whether you want to pass in your own values. So that's kind of cool to have that functionality available to you. A function can take an arbitrary number of inputs using star x as a parameter. Okay, so he basically here this star s, or this asterisk x. It doesn't have to be called x. It's just anything that you want. But if you put an asterisk in front of it, basically what that means is it specifies to Python that you'll be feeding in an arbitrary number of inputs. And what it's going to do is it's going to parse that collection of inputs as a tuple. So it's going to pass it in as a tuple. And so basically, if you say here, for example, in this function here, which I have in docstrings, if you say return length of x plus length of y of 1, here what happens is length, x has to be some iterable, right? It has to be a string or a dictionary or, a tuple or a list or a set or something like that, right? But here, the star y is any number of arguments, right? So you could have 3 comma separated arguments, and then that would be a tuple with 3 elements, okay? And so presumably at index position 1, there would be another iterable, there would be another string, or there would be another tuple, or there would be another list. But this, this basically implies that the first argument and the third argument and the third argument, and the reason why it's the third is because you have to think that the arguments that are being referred to as y here start as the second argument, right? Because the first argument is x, and the second argument, everything else is referred to as y. So if you say y of 1, it's not even the first argument of y, it's the second argument of y, which is the third argument that's coming into the function. Okay, so the first argument and third argument must be iterables like strings, lists. We've talked about that a lot in previous videos. Hopefully that's clear to you. So then what we could do is we could see an example of that. So what we do is we have a very simple function here. We have h of xy, okay? And you can see that y here is an arbitrary input. You can see it has a star in front of it. And so here what we're gonna do is we're gonna say return length of x plus length of y of 1. So here, y is not a solo input, okay? Y is a collection of inputs that will be passed into h as a tuple. It'll be passed into the function as a tuple. And so we're going to grab the element at the second or at index position 1 of that tuple, the length of it. Okay, so then what we're going to do is we're going to say print h of sup, Saturday, coffee, wakeboarding, no. Okay, so here the length of x would be 3, and then the length of y of 1 would be the length of the element in this tuple at index position 1. So if you think about all these arguments coming in or being processed, being parsed as a tuple, then here you're thinking about coffee, right? So 3 plus 6 would be the number of letters in coffee, should be 9. So that's the last thing that gets printed to the console. In the next video, we'll talk about keyword arguments. And so we'll also see that basically you can pass in arguments that are named, okay? And so basically a function can take an arbitrary number of keyword assigned inputs using 2 stars and then y as a parameter. So here we just had 1 star, and we said that you could have comma separated inputs coming in to be treated as a tuple, okay, after your concrete input x, right? And you could have more than 1 concrete input. You could have had x, y, and then star z, right? And then here they would have 2 concrete inputs, and then the rest of it is referred to as a tuple, is parsed as a tuple. But if you have star, star, y, or star, star, anything, basically that will pass in a dictionary to the function with key value pairs created by the user when the function is called. So let me show you what I mean by that. It's kind of hard to explain this without seeing an example. What we're going to do is we're going to create a function where we have all 3 types of inputs. So we have basically, so A is a concrete input. I guess I'm really going to run out of time for this in this video, but B, is a collection of comma separated inputs. And then basically C will be keyword inputs, so keyword arguments. And so what we mean by that, let's just see what this will do. So this will say, it'll start with x equals 0, and then every time it'll add on. So the length of A, whatever A is, and then the length of B. So presumably B is the number of comma separated inputs passed into the function, right? Because we were talking about how B was going to come in as a tuple, and with its length depending on the number of inputs that you passed in separated by commas, right, to the function. And then length of C. So then what we're going to do here is we'll see an example in the next video, but I want to demonstrate this in the next video because it'll probably be our last video. But keyword function of, and then basically here A is going to be storm, right, because that's just going to be the first concrete input. and then everything else up to the point that we start assigning things. So you can see that these are key value pairs that we make, where we go ahead and start basically making these assignments. And so we're going to see that in the next video. But anyway, hopefully in this video, you got a little bit more understanding of function arguments and how you can have default values coming into a function. So hopefully that was interesting for you. We'll continue in the next video. From UMills03, thanks for watching, and please subscribe.